All right, welcome to the Quadrant Community Call, January 30th, 2024. Got a few items on the list here, starting with the Unified Quadrant next steps. So, Phil, Michael, hand it over to you guys.
I see my name is against that. It looks like Mike's not on the call, but I actually haven't prepared anything for this. I didn't know it was here.
Maybe Craig threw you under the bus, Phil. Maybe he'll join afterwards. We can just move on to the next line item, and then we'll loop back around near the end. So the second line item, I think myself and Thomas are overlapping there in the next 2 points. So following the call we had to the CNCF app delivery tag in an effort to try and get submitted or get an application submitted to get into CNCF sandbox, one of the recommendations that was given to us was that we should look to try and present Quadrant to the Kubernetes SIG network. Thomas, I believe, jumped on one of those calls just to try and understand what the process is. How do we get penciled in for that scheduled slot? So Thomas, maybe I'll hand over to you. You've got more details than me. Actually,
yeah, sure. So
it's
okay. It's okay. Yeah. So like that. So next week there's a Gateway API call, and so I was on that call, which was like the one level above call, right? The network call, and there were some people also from Gateway API there. They already knew about Quadrant, and I give a very one tagline introduction to what is Quadrant, and explained that we were trying to join the CNCF, and then one of those people said, look, it would be nice if you give some more in-depth overview, technical overview presentation of Quadrant as a whole in the Gateway API call. To which I said, sure, let's do that. And so he said, take 15 minutes in the next European friendly one. It doesn't actually have to be the European friendly one, of course. We can also take another one, but given most people here are from Europe, that kind of makes sense. So yeah, I guess the action point would be who would like to do that, or maybe two people, or it's basically, yeah, it's an engineering. It's engineers mostly, and I'd say, well, maybe not only, but mostly engineers in that meeting. It can be pretty technical. It can really be about how we do things and why, I guess.
Yeah, so I guess the ask there is if we can get together and put together a slide deck, a technically focused slide deck for that audience, and then have, as Thomas said, one or two people look to do that presentation to that group. We're looking for volunteers.
And if well, we don't have to decide in this call, but I just wanted to put it out there. We can talk offline.
I don't mind though. You can put my name beside it. If it gets into some technical questions around some of the algorithmic stuff, I may have to defer. But yeah, and I'm thinking Paul can probably reuse some of the content from the CNCF slides.
I can be there and support you, David.
Yeah, I'll be on that call as well. I'm actually in Europe that coming Tuesday.
Cool.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. That was easy. Yeah, so final note then, Alex, you've got a topic of defaults and overrides.
Yeah, so I guess the idea is just, again, to re-socialize, because I'm sort of going to repeat myself, but we can discuss it somewhat here as well. So we've been trying a few times already to solve this default and override problem or let's say feature capability that policy attachment gives us. And let's be honest, for all the people that tried, certainly I tried, it's really hard. And it's a very complex problem. Though every time we did it was at the level of, say, the rate limit policy or the auth policy. And I was thinking that maybe it would be worthwhile to try to combine that with the meta policies. So let's take sort of a simple example. Let's say, actually, I should have thought about that better. Nothing's ever really simple or easy, right? Because I was going to use auth, but like use it like at something that doesn't expose the entire surface area of, let's say, what the auth policy, just to pick on that one, gives to people, right? Sort of get a controlled, and what the right level is part of the question, API to sort of do OAuth, for example, right? And what is it? What are the guardrails that you might want to put in place there, and how do we enable through defaults and overrides to operate within those boundaries? At a further qualifying policy level, further down the hierarchy of, say, you attach a thing at your gateway, and then you attach a policy that further qualifies what you want to happen at the HTTP route level. So that's kind of the idea that I was toying with. I can make some parallel with rate limiting, for instance. I think I have some ideas around auth, but I was thinking that maybe trying to do it there and then transform those meta policies into effective auth policies, or sorry, an effective auth policy, singular, right? Might be a way to sort of slowly test ideas out and augment the use
Complexity.
cases. Yes, but so augment the use cases at those individual meta policy levels, as well as augment the use cases by supporting more meta policies, right? And sort of apply those patterns and see where this leads us with regards to possibly one day then being able to enable defaults and overrides at the auth policy level. Sorry to be picking on auth policy all of the time. Everything I say, like actually, we even toyed with ideas where a meta policy could create like an auth policy and a rate limit policy as well, right? So obviously, everything I say tries to be applicable to all of the policies that we may support. But again, I get the idea is to reduce the scope through the meta policies, and from day one, sort of design those meta policies to have some kind of support for defaults and overrides. Thomas.
Yeah, I like the idea. I think we should, in parallel, also check what the latest status is of the ideas that Gateway API has on this subject of inherited policies, right? Because I remember something about not merging. I'm not sure if that's. I don't remember. I'm not sure if things have changed how they look at it. Like so, we want to be sure in the end that we are also fit that definition, right? We don't want to define ourselves something that doesn't comply with what's being cooked there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm just going to say yes. Obviously, I think, again, there's multiple ways whether they do it or not, where we could do different things, right? It's all in the spec. Well, anyways, sure. Guy, sorry.
The new GEP on direct policy attachment should be out at any time now. I mean, it was promised for late January, so and it's promised definitely for 1.1. So at any time, we should see at least a draft version of the request by Nick Young. Defaults and overrides is a thing that, as far as I understand, belongs to that other part of policy attachment, right? The inherited policy attachment one. So I don't know when we're going to get some better definition on those, right? As far as I understand, Nick's working on extracting from that one big GEP 713 that part that defines only direct policy attachment and the use case for that, right? So we will not see anything about defaults and overrides there, right? Should be very simple use cases where I imagine it's going to be the typical either or kind of thing, right? So it's you're targeted one object, that's going to be the effective policy that you apply, period. No do not have to work out the relations between policy and this kind of stuff. And plus, it's also I expected that policies that fall within this realm of direct policy attachment, the typical kind of policy that would not cascade down, right, to other resources. So something that I don't even know how that's going to be defined, but something that affects that one and only resource only at that level. Whereas default overrides, and I will hand it back to you in a minute, Thomas, is what characterize so-called inherited policy attachment, right? I see meta policy as yet another thing, and it's a more sophisticated use case, right? Where, if I understand correct, you're talking about policies, right? What kind of policies you can create or you cannot create, or if you create, what's gonna happen in the end? Because the current definition we have for defaults and overrides, right, in inherited policy attachment, they do not cover those more complex use cases, such as what is the maximum that you can put on this field here, for example, right? Let's say it's a numeric value and you want to ensure that it's below some threshold, this kind of stuff, right? Rather, it's also about either or, but it's a more granular level, right? So if you set some default at the level of that one field, it's whether going to be either it's going to be that value that was a default or some other thing defined at a lower level that overrides it, right? But again, if it's the value says it's default 50 overridden with 100, it's going to be 100, right? There's no such thing as a way to define it's a maximum of whatever, right? So that requires some more elaborate language that currently it's not part of the examples we have, at least for defaults and overrides. So maybe we can come up with our own kind of policies that allow that kind expressing that kind of rule, and we find a way to translate that into underlying defaults and overrides from policy attachment. But maybe that's not what you were suggesting, Alex.
Yeah, sorry, giving it to you in a sec, Thomas. Maybe I'm because I also see Aaron like in the comments. That's not what I was. No. What I want is this higher level abstraction that gets transformed. It has nothing to do with authorization, right? It's the and maybe it's I'm getting the words wrong, but I thought it was this meta controller thing that takes a policy and transforms it into another. Am I using the wrong naming here?
Yeah, meta controller is one project that one of the things it does is exactly what you said, right?
Right.
You can take a YAML. Yeah.
And that's what I'm focusing on. So reducing the scope of the API that we expose in a single sign-on of policy. Single sign-on policy, whatever that means, right? And now you define the language in there. And sorry, now I'm going to expand a little further, and then I give it to you, Thomas. So yes, you're right. Today, like everything that's been discussed is about defaults and overrides are being the same in the sense that they are the spec of the policy that would be the spec part of the policy attached in a direct one, right? So one, I don't know that this has to remain true, but even if it has, let's use the min, max, and default as an example, right? If you have a min, that's say it's a positive value, right? The value that you're trying to figure out. So you have a min that's 0 or 1 or whatever. It's sort of implied. It's the default value. It doesn't need to be specified. Max is whatever, float, I guess, YAML, so YOLO, anything. Max value, right? And default would be max if it's not specified. So see the kind of thing? And now you can have that like in the two specs. They use the same language, and you just defined a way for somebody to define a min, a max, and then somebody default may have been the wrong word, like effective value, whatever, right? And so I can specify that one and now because of the default and override model and where it sits in the hierarchy, if that value is not within the bounds that were given by the level above, well, it's going to go to whatever it should be, right? Again, heuristics-based stuff. And that's all things that we can, I think, spec only, well, only in scary quotes, within this meta controller, right? That then transforms into the full-blown rate limit policy that supports way more. So let's reuse what I did as an example. You would have the per minute rate limit, right? And the only thing it lets you specify is the actual amounts of requests you can do on a per limit basis, right? So you cannot override things like by what the conditions. Let's talk rate limit. There's no overriding or merging of conditions. We got rid of that problem, right? The only thing we're solving is this value. All the rest is hard coded. So that's what I mean by sort of diminishing the area that the API exposes while still being useful, because this more specific CRD now actually solves an actual use case, right? And if you're outside of this use case, well, you can still use your rate limit policy that gives you all the power that you want, but you give up on the guardrails and on the defaults and overrides because we haven't cracked it for the whole, say, set of problem that the power of the rate limit or the auth policy gives you. Because trying to crack that nut all at once, again, I tried and I failed in the past. So I'm like, maybe having a more iterative approach that also gives us a point in time where we can gather feedback from people actually using it, I think would be good. So now, Thomas, I guess. Sorry.
It's very short. Yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. And also, I would just want to say, like, and maybe given that we are so much focused on policies, like all the other players in the Gateway API calls most of them are not so much focused on policy. So we can actually help shape this. Like, again, that's still there. And I think we should take that opportunity. That's it.
Yeah, I think that's key too, right? Because what I just described, Alex, if you go back to the spec, the wordings there and the example there would have to change, right? Because I think if I'm getting right, what you're saying is that we could have a different API for defining defaults and overrides compared to the actual policy that you try to apply. And let's try to exemplify that with a more concrete use case. Like, let's say you are, as a platform engineer, you write a policy that says, it's a rate limit policy, and it says spec, default, right? And the default says max value, rate limit 50, right? And you also, maybe in the same policy, override max value 30 for something else, right? For some other specific, I don't know, matching rule. And then as an app developer, you try to apply a rate limit policy, right? Maybe you will not define things in terms of defaults and overrides because you're targeting an HP root. So what you're doing is you're trying to define one simple and straightforward rate limit set of rules for your HP root. And maybe you put the 75, right, as the rate limit policy, the rate limit rate, right, that you want, right, the maximum request per second that you want. Then we need to work out those two. What we read from the platform engineer defined policy that said maximum 50 for one thing as a default, maximum, I don't know, 30 for another matching rule as an override, and then decide what's the actual value will be in the effective policy, right? But the one who writes the policy for targeting the HP root would not have to define defaults and overrides, right, in this particular scenario that I'm describing. And therefore, the policy that person writes can be a lot simpler in terms of the API, right? And will not be defining maximum or minimum or whatever, not setting boundaries, neither as default nor as overrides. You're just requesting one specific RPS, and that's it, right? If you go back to how it's currently described and the examples there, the examples do not cover this kind of stuff, right? It's usually at the level of the field. The name of the field is very important there. And all the examples are like that. So if you define that RPS has to be 50, it's either a default or an override, and that's all you get. Someone else would define an RPS, and then you either use the 50 as the default or not, right? But that's it. So we would need to probably work together with Gateway API team in explaining those use cases and showing that there's a use case for policies with this kind of expression. So I've been seeing people share a bunch of stuff in the chat, and I also would like,
So to what you're saying, I realize, crap, what's in the word? When I said at some point default, right? So the spec, I guess what you're saying is that, right? That the default and override, like the spec is the same as for direct policy attachment, actually, right? It's the same spec, right? When I'm in default, I'm in the default value. Say you have min, max, and actual values. Those are 3 fields in that struct, right? What I was trying to say by default value, when you specify min and a max, for instance, by default, the effective value will be min, right? Now, what you care about is having an effective value. That's the only field you really care about, let's say in the case of request per second thing, right? So now it's the operator that takes care that if you specify further down the tree, right, an effective value that is less than the minimal or over the max, it sort of rejects it and then uses whatever the default value would have been. So I know it's a bit of a crap example, and maybe I'm really good. So none of those 3 fields are effectively ever required for as long as you have enough of them. So let's say if you only have a min, it defaults to the min. If you only have a max, it defaults to the max, right? And this is why I said like the min would default to 0. And when I say default, I mean that's a default value for that struct fields in the absence of it in the spec. Anyways, maybe I'm too contorting the example, but back to what you were saying, well, 2 things, 2 remarks. I don't know that the examples are meant to be exhaustive. And I must admit, I haven't looked at the latest state of the spec, so maybe now it has become clearer. I don't seem to remember there was a clear specification that the set has to be the exact same, right? It's all about the merging, right? The list, we had this discussion before. So I get that problem, but there's other ways I think that you can reason about the problem set, even with those YAML requirements in place, I'm going to call them. But all that to say, I think it's worth testing out, see where that, to where we can bring that, where it breaks apart. And then as Craig was saying, right, that's, I think, very good feedback to bring back to that jet before actually all that stuff becomes final and then carved in stone. And then we realize it makes it really hard to cover certain use cases. Craig.
I really like the idea that you're spreading, but I also really, I think it's quite powerful to be able to have a different spec in the overrides and the defaults. I'd almost be tempted to just go into Slack and start talking about that and see what they say, because that way you can sort of control features around policy without being constrained by the spec of the policy, if you know what I mean. So like that field means something to you in that context, as in like what Alex was describing. I'm not going to repeat it all. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I like that idea of expanding on different specs in overrides and defaults.
Let me try to reply to Hiram here. I'm seeing his comments on the chat and about using the emission webhooks for that. And I think traditionally that's how it's being done, and it still is, right? I think the challenge here is how we try to model the same kind of functionality and more, right? Within the Gateway API policy attachment inherited policies framework, right? That has those defaults and overrides thing, meaning it's all expressed, through those APIs, right? Rather than having the classical webhooks where you can pretty much implement whatever function that you want that to validate whatever new resources that come in.
Yeah. I was assuming you guys would have CRs that expresses the limits on those policies, right? Implemented, but I was saying, do you guys implement that at emission mutation time, or is it a controller mutating stuff after the fact?
Well, We could, right? But there is a life cycle problem. Think of like those bounds, like let's reuse rate limit policy as a thing, right? For some reason, like the system behaves a little bit crappy and somebody reduces that max for a while. Now you want that other policy status probably still reflect that it got like synthetically limited, right? And then I don't know, problem foobar, like the network blips between two things, whatever, are solved, and the platform engineer, quote unquote, re-raises the max. So thing you want that policy to sort of become okay. So I'm not saying we should maybe not reject because it's a valid life cycle thing, but we also need to cover the use case where the effective policy eventually becomes valid change.
Basically, you want to cover the case where you change the limits on an existing policy, and now you want to somehow deal with that.
Right. Which is not to say that when you try to submit like a quote unquote, but actually same problem again. Like let's reuse the RPS, right? We're in the middle of this, I don't know, DDoS mitigation or whatever, and artificially we diminish the max RPS to 50, whatever that means. I know we said RPS, so it means 50. So 50, right? We diminish to that, and I want to push a thing that maxes to 70, because let's say I know that whenever that incident is mitigated, it's going to go back to 100. So my 70 is actually valid, right? So decoupling the life cycle thing is interesting. I don't know that I have an answer, right? But
so I think part of this discussion, we're going to have to think about like how does it affect CI/CD pipelines and shit like that. Like, let's say you have an Argo that just keeps stepping on your controller, and now you have a controller fight, right? On that value. So, like, I don't know what the right answer to this is, right? I mean, I'm just saying we got to think about these things. Just because we step on it doesn't mean, like, a lot of people are using CI/CD, and they're just going to step on you back.
So in Gatekeeper, it's just all up to having it configurable, so you can have it like outright reject something, or just have it become a violation warning. So that could be an option as well. Leave it to the platform engineer, configure it what way they want. And then it could step on it, or it could just reject when they're trying to undo what you did with Argo, you know?
Yeah, but I mean, it doesn't solve the problem of, okay, it's already exists, right? Because admission hooks, mutation hooks don't solve that problem.
Yeah,
once it already exists.
So in that case, it goes into a violation, and then it's up to the platform engineer. Do they want to do something about that? At least that's
so the crazy, oh yeah, because I guess your mutation hook would catch you after that. Once you change it, now the mutation hook would basically reject the request after that when you try to change it back again.
Yeah, exactly.
For the API specs of the policies, of our policies, I think there's an interesting point also by David on the chat that kind of looks like it's an alternative, more in line, or maybe not necessarily in line with the meta controller usage described by Alex before, but definitely another option than having two different specs for defaults and overrides compared to the actual requested policy, right? I think what you said, David, was if we had yet another kind of policy, right, such as a one that is very specific about, for example, setting a max value, right? So let's say we would have a rate limited policy max configuration that would translate into a rate limited policy that enforces those maximum values, right? If that's what I'm getting from your comment there.
Exactly, yeah. And I guess it's not too far from what Craig was, I think he's suggesting with policy constraints. It's a name on a particular policy constraint resource. So you could be generic and call it policy constraints. It could be very configurable, like Gatekeeper again with Regal, or it can be very specific about rate limits or specific fields in your rate limit policy. We could go either way.
Yeah, the reason I'm bringing it up is because I see two different possible routes, maybe not mutually exclusive, but one is having those meta policies, if you will, right, that we use to later on give more context and compute the effective policy, right? And another one is one that changes the way gateway API sees policy, inherited policy attachment to, or maybe they already do, it's not properly explained in the spec, right? But make sure that it's part of the spec, this possibility of having defaults and overrides with a different API, effectively, a different API spec compared to the simpler form where it just requests a direct policy to be attached to a resource. Alex.
So partially yes to what you said, but the one thing I wanted to add, the route that I would want to avoid going though is using those policy constraints and defaults and overrides for our stuff, because which by the way is an option, right? So I like last time I checked at least, and until all that's final, I guess that can still change, but like a policy does, like since now we have direct, like you can only be direct and that's okay. But if we start supporting both, right, it becomes like this matrix explosion of things and what they will mean. And it's effectively two tools to solve the same problem. Not saying that you potentially can do more with defaults and overrides and or the other, but there is a clear overlap though. And I think going to the two routes is going to just create a nightmare for us. So for as long as the spec is still, say, work in progress, I think it would be worthwhile to investigate that route. Not saying not worthwhile to investigate the other, right?
Yeah, like if there's not a clear definition of how to do defaults and overrides already in the gateway API spec, then I think meta policies could cover defaults and overrides pretty easily, right?
Yeah, I was thinking something similar, right? If the policy constraints ends up, being something that covers all the use cases we know for defaults and overrides, then that is a question that I think is valid to bring to the Gateway API group, right? Because maybe, I don't know if people are asking that question, maybe we don't even need defaults and overrides in the end, right? Maybe we already have all the tools we need, to implement that kind of use case, right? I mean, actually asking, I'm not sure. But if it happens to exist some disjoint set there that we would only cover with defaults overrides, I think it's important that we know and highlight that.
Yeah, like the thing is, if I understand the original idea of defaults and overrides, it's like CRs override other CRs and stuff all internally, and they don't actually reflect those changes back into the CRs, right? That's sort of
they merge them.
They merge them, but in an internal memory model kind of thing that's not reflected in the CR. So it's kind of like people have to do the math in their head to understand the end result. That's the one downside to that strategy.
There is actually a proposal to solve that problem. And actually that tool builds on the fact that they use the exact same language, by the way. It's a kubectl extension that will just effectively dump to you what the how is it called again, the effective policy is, like the result of the merge. Okay. And there's been some discussion. The problem, like, put that in the status. The issue is the size problem, possibly.
Yeah. By the way, that tool exists already, right? It only happens that it's focused in one particular example kind of policy, which is the backend TLS policy. But the tool exists. It was implemented.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that was the only one downside to that over like something that's just steps on CRs. Because then it's very visual to the user. Either your policy got rejected because it didn't conform to the meta policy, or it's something updated behind your back or something. It's very obvious.
On the meta policies thing, something that kind of made it jump out to me as being quite valuable as well was like this idea of splitting up authentication and authorization. So if you have different resources, you can start to use RBAC and Kubernetes to decide who can do what. So if you have an authentication CR that can set, which SSO server to use or which realm to use, and then you have an authorization policy that allows you to set which permissions are allowed to, which permissions. Sorry, my brain is not working today. Which permissions you need to access a particular endpoint. You can then split that up quite well with RBAC in Kubernetes and say like only the cluster admin can create, or if you create a user called a gateway admin, for instance, can create this particular policy, and the developer and everybody else can create an authorization policy, right? So I think it's actually quite a neat solution. So I think we definitely need to give thought to both of those things and see if, like, again, back to what are the problems we're trying to solve, because maybe that's enough for now, right? And it use case specific policies, they're quite common in things like Solo and Kong, right? Like you see things like OAuth policy, and there's a bunch of other ones that I can't think of, but they're basically all, you could basically cover them all with our auth policy right now. Yeah, so yeah, that was it really.
Yeah, I see that. I see what you're saying, and I agree that that's definitely something we should pursue and relatively easy to achieve, right? Basically, we're talking about defining new kinds of policies so we can have some more fine-grained RBAC, right? At the same time, I'm not entirely convinced that that would be enough to cover for defaults and overrides, right? Because let's say you have, let's take that as one example. You have authentication policy and you have authorization policy. Keep it simple. And now you can create RBAC for authentication separately from authorization, right? But still, if you want to define defaults, right, for only the authentication part, right, what would be the default authentication? You're saying that if you deny, try and translate this back to RBAC. So if you deny users with the privilege of creating authentication policies, the one that exists that say was created by a super user becomes the default. Because I still don't see how to accommodate defaults and overrides only by splitting those more complex kind of policies into more specific ones. I think we still need to have defaults and overrides as part of the spec in order to express that, right? Either because it's how it was proposed by Gateway API, the API spec has a field called defaults and another one called overrides, or some other way. Let's say we define another kind of policy that it's a default authentication policy. Another one's an override authentication policy kind of policy. You know what I mean? So I think what I'm trying to say is that I think that those are for different problems. One is the RBAC problem, right? And another one is for the defaults and overrides, which is not necessarily an RBAC thing. Make sense?
Yeah. Yeah, I wonder though if they can kind of work pretty closely together. And I wonder how far we could get without overcomplicating things with defaults and overrides. You know, like again, if we kind of start with some relatively simple use cases, maybe we can help to define the. Oh my God, my brain is not working today, guys. You know what I'm trying to say? Like, if we keep it simple, then we can solve some very simple use cases, and then let use cases flow in from the customers saying, I need to be able to do X, Y, and Z, in which case we could then add a lot more complexity and say, okay, so now we're going to move towards defaults and overrides for these particular sets of use cases.
Yeah. I mean, if we think this is important, it's because we have some use cases in our minds, right? We should write those up and then come up with some mock resources to express those policies in those interactions without writing a code. Just like, do these resources make logical sense to a user implementing the system? And if they're complicated and hard to follow, maybe it's the bad idea. You know?
I agree. All right, are we done with this one for now? I'm sure that everyone's eagerly anticipating the epic brief at this stage, Ski.
Yeah, no pressure. So just looping back to the original line item in the agenda, Craig, I believe you might have added this one with respect to unified quadrant next steps. Do you want to cover that on this call, or do you want to maybe wait till next week?
I did add it. I don't know if Phil or someone is willing to just jump in on it.
I can give it a go.
Yeah.
So this is essentially me, Craig, and Mike were talking about this earlier today, and the idea here is to take the DNS and TLS policy logic out of the managed gateway controller and multi-cluster gateway controller, sorry, and put that into the quadrant controller to manage the DNS and TLS policy. But part of that then is taking the bit of the DNS policy controller in the multi-cluster gateway controller that actually sends the DNS records to a DNS provider would not be part of that migration. And also the part that deals with executing health checks also wouldn't be part of that. That would need to stay in a separate controller. Yeah, I think that's essentially it. Right?
Yeah. So kind of, there's nothing too contentious here. We just wanted to bring it up, which is, it's a similar pattern to all the other stuff. You know, we have auth policy, which creates an auth config for Auth3No. We have rate limit policy to create limits for limited or TLS policy creates certificates for cert manager. So rather than dumping all the DNS logic into the quadrant operator, we figured we would keep that as a separate repo that would be a reconciler for DNS record and DNS health check. And then the policy controller's responsibility would remain the same as for the other policies, and that it would basically take that policy and convert it into those resources and allow the enforcement component to actually make that a reality. Well, that I just wanted to share it anyway, just so if there's anything that doesn't sound too contentious anyway. It seems like nobody's too worried about that. If you've got any questions about it though, or concerns, just pop them into Slack and we can talk through them more there. Yeah, that was it.
Thanks, Craig. So I think we've covered everything on the agenda. Is there anything else anyone wants to raise, or are we happy to wrap it up now?
So what's happening next Tuesday? Okay, that was a lame attempt. Somebody filling in the blank. Since it's supposed to be the community thing, I think recording next Tuesday's Gateway API community call and the presentation of Kuadrant there. I think we should put a link in this doc. Even though everybody on this call knew about it, but I would record it there.
Yeah, I did add a link to the note doc from that call. That's not what you mean, probably.
I'll do it.
Thanks, Alex. All right, I guess we can wrap it up then. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.